Good evening, I'm Sandra Sully. This is the Late Night News. Heading the Late Night News, charges of attempted assassination may be laid against the gunman who fired on the White House. Bitter words amid new developments in the saga of missing Australian backpacker David Wilson. And the Liberals forced to reconsider their stand on federal intervention in state affairs. First tonight, the American Secret Service is still considering whether to charge the man who fired on the White House with attempted assassination of President Bill Clinton. 26-year-old Francisco Martin Duran was arrested after firing more than 20 shots from an assault rifle into the building. They say while Duran has no criminal record, he was dishonourably discharged from the army after serving several years in a military prison.
For the second time in 2 months, a serious breach of White House security. The gunman, captured here on amateur video, pulls out his weapon and begins firing through the perimeter fence.
There were two gentlemen that did the initial tackling, and because the guy was probably ready to reload that gun.
Moments later, Secret Service agents and White House security staff were running to the scene. The shooter, 26-year-old Francisco Duran, quickly taken into custody. More than 20 rounds of ammunition were fired during the attack, shattering windows in the White House press room, bullets embedded in wooden sills. The gun used, an SKS Chinese semi-automatic, is one of the assault weapons now banned in the US. President Bill Clinton was in the residence at the time, watching a football match on television. He heard the shots, but at no time was in any danger. Having just returned from one of the world's hotspots, the president later made light of the attack.
It was nice to be home in the safety and security of the White House after going to the Middle East.
But the Secret Service isn't so jovial, already reviewing all security measures at the White House. Today's attack is the second major assault on the White House in 6 weeks. In early September, a man flew a light plane into the grounds, crashing into a wall just below the president's bedroom. The FBI is treating the shooting as an assassination attempt. Security around the president will be increased. Louise Cosgrove, 10 News.
At home, more problems for Ansett Airlines when one of its Fokkers was turned back on a flight from Norfolk Island to Sydney. Ansett says the F-28 developed problems with one of its 2 hydraulic systems.
Ansett says Flight 872 developed landing gear problems soon after takeoff on one of its 4 weekly flights from Norfolk. As a precaution, the pilot turned back, circling the island before touching down just after 8:30 last night.
The aircraft landed safely and was brought to a stop by the pilot.
Well, after he landed, he said he couldn't taxi because he'd lost the brakes, and then there was all fluid running out. If you looked out the window, you could see that the fire brigade had sprayed the foam because they'd lost petrol.
Last night's drama came just 10 days after an Ansett Jumbo landed on its nose at Sydney Airport after turning back on a flight to Japan. The 38 passengers and 4 crew stranded on Norfolk overnight arrived back in Sydney late today, relieved to be home.
Also, we're glad to be back. Well, it was yes, it was very frightening, but the pilot was marvellous and there's nothing to worry about.
Ansett engineers have begun a preliminary investigation. The Bureau of Air Safety will launch its own inquiry once the aircraft is returned to Sydney. Sean Murphy, 10 News.
A bitter slanging match has developed between the family of Khmer Rouge hostage David Wilson and Foreign Minister Gareth Evans. The family has condemned Senator Evans for announcing Wilson is probably dead and accused the federal government of washing its hands of the crisis. But the minister has hit back, saying the family's attack was hurtful and the government was doing all it could.
The Wilson children in happier times, but today tears after the government announcement that brother David is probably dead. The family believes he's still alive.
It seems to us that they're putting foreign trade relations with Cambodia and their own personal political ambitious careers ahead of the life of an Australian citizen.
But Foreign Minister Gareth Evans hit back, saying the allegations are hurtful.
I don't think those criticisms would be shared by David's parents, with whom we've been most closely in touch. But I don't want to be critical in any way of the family. People do lash out.
Wilson and 2 other Westerners were kidnapped by the Khmer Rouge more than 2 months ago. His family believes he's been moved from a village heavily shelled by the Cambodian military and that the government should cut aid to Cambodia to force more action. But Senator Evans says everything that can be done is being done.
We won't rest in this matter until we either have, hopefully, proof of life and the safe release of David and the other 2 hostages, or in the event that the worst has happened, we won't rest until we have clear proof of death.
Despite the assurances, the family believes there are too many unanswered questions, and the media hasn't helped by painting a picture of a reckless tourist.
He was going to teach English to the Cambodians, and this is... We don't appreciate the way the media has... This is his reward, David.
Alan Russell, 10 News.
The Liberal Party is moving for a referendum to stop federal governments overriding the states. Debate of Tasmania's anti-gay laws at the Liberals' weekend conference has reopened raw nerves, forcing leader Alexander Downer to consider the referendum, despite objections from one of his most senior ministers.
On display today, Tasmania's anger at the use of external affairs powers to override its criminal laws.
Cheating scumbag government. And if that offends a few of you lily-livered Liberals, tough titties.
The Tasmanian Premier extended his disappointment to his federal colleagues who had deserted his government.
And you can say we're wrong about our laws, but please respect our Constitution.
2 resolutions for a curbing of the use of the Foreign Affairs power and, if necessary, using a referendum were passed without dissent. Opposition leader Alexander Downer was forewarned. In his closing address, he tried to hose down the issue.
We're going to restore the proper processes of consultation with the states and proper accountability to the Australian people.
Mr Downer promised to consider a constitutional referendum, but his Foreign Affairs spokesman Peter Reith doesn't think that is a good idea.
I have real concerns about the referendum proposal.
And Mr Downer announced the opposition would put the government's human rights credentials to the test by introducing a bill in Parliament to outlaw compulsory unionism. And there was a tribute to Sir Robert Menzies. Mr Downer recalled friends had to buy Sir Robert and Dame Patty a house after the former Prime Minister's retirement.
Now that is an example of putting public service above self-interest. Let me just add, it is one from which others could certainly learn.
Paul Bongiorno, 10 News.
When we come back, the FBI joins the nationwide search for 2 toddlers missing after a carjacking. And Moscow still playing down the seriousness of its Arctic oil spill. In the United States, federal agencies have been called into the hunt for 2 young boys victims of a carjacking. Police are mystified they found no trace of the car and 2 children, despite scores of tip-offs in the last 5 days.
Thank you. Y'all have a good day.
Union, South Carolina is haunted by the memory of 2 small faces. Alex and Michael Smith have been missing since Tuesday. Thousands across the country have called to say they think they have seen them. Today, the FBI installed a new computer system to sort all the tips.
Please help us find Michael.
They'll most likely get more now that this public service announcement has been released nationwide.
Was last seen wearing a red and white striped outfit and a blue and red coat.
Unfortunately, most children abducted by strangers never come home. In a study of 1,540 cases compiled over the past 10 years, only 393 were found alive. 211 were found dead. The rest are still missing. Searchers in Michigan this week were looking for a California boy who disappeared 10 years ago. They're still getting tips. For parents, the world has become one big scary place. Residents in Smithton, Illinois, held an emergency meeting this morning after a stranger tried to snatch 3 of their children in 1 month. Statistically, it is 1,000 times more likely that a child would be taken by someone in their family. Last night, police in Florida found the body of a 7-year-old girl who had been reported missing and charged her stepfather with murder.
I love her little brothers, miss her so much.
The mother admitted her tears had covered a hoax. Here's Here in South Carolina, some wonder whether Alex and Michael Smith's mother is telling the truth about how they disappeared. The sheriff admits there have been some discrepancies in Susan Smith's story, but cautions against jumping to conclusions.
Not only is she the victim in this case, but the public is trying to make her the suspect as well. That's quite logical in a case like this.
When there is still no hard evidence after 4 days of searching, only a mother's word.
In Moscow, officials are still playing down the seriousness of the oil spill in Russia's Arctic region near Usinsk. They insist only 14,000 tonnes of oil escaped, but haven't revoked their appeal for international help to handle the leak.
Even as officials were claiming the accident was totally eliminated 7 weeks ago, we saw their workers still scraping up sticky black oil from this river. It looked a hopeless task. The water flowing through the pipes in the hurriedly erected dam is only marginally cleaner, yet it flows into the water supply of thousands of Arctic workers. This workman told me he used to catch beautiful red fish in the river. Now what am I supposed to eat, he said. This black sausage?
The full extent of this oil leak may only become clear in the spring, when the snow cover here melts.
At a news conference, the pipeline operators, Komineft, played down the size of the spillage, but admitted, squirming under questioning, that they'd continued to pump oil through the damaged pipeline for 3 weeks after it sprung major leaks. Now they're hastily building a new pipeline, using homemade equipment because the company's broke. Confidential figures divulged by a Komineft engineer show there were 500 or 600 leaks a year in the old pipeline. They hope to replace the most corroded section by the end of November, but that's at least 4 years too late for the environment here.
Although American President Bill Clinton has only just returned from his peace mission in the Middle East, clashes continue between Israelis and Arabs. The latest fighting occurred on the Israel-Lebanon border when one Israeli soldier was killed and at least 4 wounded. Security sources say militant Hezbollah guerrillas attacked an Israeli outpost on the border. Later, one Lebanese civilian died and a dozen more injured when Israeli artillery fired some 200 shells into rugged hills used by the guerrillas north of the border. The United Nations has threatened to order NATO airstrikes against Bosnian government forces near the capital Sarajevo after a shelling attack on a French observation post. The government forces have launched a major infantry offensive against Serb positions on Mount Ignam, overlooking Sarajevo.
Attempts by French UN troops actually to demilitarize the so-called demilitarized zone round Mount Igman have met with repeated failure and frustration. Today, the Bosnian government forces, known as the BIH, used the area as the launch pad for a fresh attack on the Serbs.
At 6:45 this morning, BIH started an offensive by infiltrating in the southeast of the DMZ, so violating the DMZ, supported by artillery fire.
In recent months, the Bosnian government forces have been gaining in strength. The arms embargo, which had previously hampered them, has been leaking like a sieve, and they fielded effective artillery units. Now the Americans are moving at the UN to lift it altogether, but there's still opposition.
This is not a resolution that is supported by all the members of the Security Council, but there are members who do support it, and there are members who understand the necessity of moving the process forward and trying to find some resolution to the issue.
The Council still isn't ready to take the vote that the Bosnian government wants.
For those who do not believe that this is the right next step, then the simple question is, what other options do they offer? What other compromise do they offer?
The embargo would not be lifted for at least 6 months, a move opposed by the British and French, who have most troops on the ground at risk from Serbian retaliation. But the draft resolution calls for a plan for their orderly and safe redeployment if necessary. That's UN speak for withdrawal.
Still to come, the AMA again rejects proposals to reform Australia's private health system, and controversy over plans for a new spire on Melbourne's Arts Centre. A 4-year-old child has died in a car accident on the Hume Highway in New South Wales. The child was killed when a car overturned outside Goulburn this afternoon. A baby suffered abrasions and a woman back and leg injuries in the crash. Both are being treated in Goulburn Base Hospital. It was the second fatality on the Hume Highway today. Earlier, a 31-year-old truck driver died when his vehicle smashed into a tree. The Australian Medical Association has again rejected sweeping reforms to our private health insurance industry proposed by the federal government. Doctors say the latest proposals intended to make Australians less reliant on Medicare would still put private cover out of the reach of low-income earners.
Under the proposed reforms, doctors will be able to negotiate direct contracts with insurance companies. The move is one of several the federal government wants introduced to ease the burden on an overloaded Medicare system and to encourage more patients to purchase private cover. But a meeting of the Australian Medical Association in Canberra has been told the changes will only benefit the wealthy, who often bypass Medicare and pay cash for health services.
And the private sector is going to become not affordable and accessible to pensioners and low-income earners.
The AMA is also worried the changes will threaten quality and limit patient choices in the private sector. It wants the government to introduce a means-tested subsidy to help those who need it the most afford private insurance.
We're concerned that in the long term, doctors may feel that their interests are better served by looking after the insurance company with whom they have a contract than the patient.
Dr Carmen Lawrence is expected to introduce the health insurance legislation during the December sitting of Federal Parliament. Brendan Stafford, 10 News.
Vietnam veterans are to launch another court challenge for compensation from the federal government. This follows new developments surrounding their claims that Agent Orange and other defoliants are linked to birth abnormalities suffered by many children of Vietnam veterans.
The federal government now accepts that Australian troops who served in Vietnam suffered serious health problems because of exposure to harmful chemicals. But what's still at issue is whether defoliants and insecticides like Agent Orange, Chlordane and Dieldrin caused birth defects in veterans' children. The veterans say they're about to take that issue before the federal court.
It seems to be a major problem that we're getting a lot of reports to the Association of children of Vietnam veterans suffering from quite severe abnormalities.
Instead of blaming just one chemical, the veterans' case is that a cocktail of chemicals they were exposed to caused deformities in their children.
Just from legs missing, limbs missing, spina bifida, cleft palate seem to be quite common.
But the federal government refuses to accept responsibility.
And there is no conclusive evidence, as I understand it, to link exposure to herbicides such as Agent Orange used in Vietnam during the Vietnam War and birth defects. There is a lot of anecdotal evidence.
The Vietnam veterans intend using this court action as a test case. And if it's successful, they plan to follow up with a whole series of lawsuits seeking compensation for veterans' children with birth defects. John Hill, 10 News.
Canberra's Greek community has commemorated the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Athens by Greek and Allied forces. It took 4 years to free Athens from the Axis forces, which invaded the ancient city in October of 1940. 15,000 Australians from the 6th Division took part in defending Greece, but were evacuated when the Germans overran the country. Finally, Greek and Allied forces drove the Germans out and restored democracy to Athens. Today, wreaths were laid in honour of those who died. Plans for the new spire on Melbourne's Arts Centre have been unveiled, and already there's controversy over the $4 million addition to the city skyline. Officials say the new spire is necessary because stress fractures in the original are threatening to cause it to collapse.
The Arts Centre's 10th birthday coincided with today's unveiling of a new look for one of Melbourne's most impressive landmarks. The modifications have been forced by the failings of the old spire. Stress fractures have been found at its base, and the only alternative is to start again. The cost, a mere $4 million.
The new and improved spire is of course being boasted as bigger and better than the original, with an additional 46 metres pushing its overall height to more than 150 metres.
Those behind the project believe the new spire will give Melbourne's cultural headquarters a more finished look. They say the old one had to be chopped short because of a lack of funds. The rebuilding of the top end of the Arts Centre will take about 8 months and is a relatively simple exercise.
The existing spar will be taken down in sections by a crane, and the new spar will just be erected in sections, fabricated probably off-site and erected in smaller sections and put together.
While some of those who saw the model today believe $4 million could have been better spent, the government believes it's getting value for money.
It pays tribute to the original vision of the architect, but at the same time it completes that vision in a way that the current one doesn't.
Peter Morris, 10 News.
The $1 million replica of the famous Vickers Vimy biplane has finally landed in Brisbane on the final leg of its epic journey from England. The plane is an exact copy of the one flown by South Australia's pioneer aviators Keith and Ross Smith. They completed the trip from England in just 30 days, a record back in 1919. Now Australian Lane Kidby and American Peter McMillan have retraced the Smiths' route and today became star attractions at the Brisbane Air Show. However, their journey won't end until they fly their Vickers Vimy to Adelaide and the Australian Grand Prix. In a moment, the latest on our weather, frogs in the news for the next week, and sports tonight with Bill Woods.
In a moment, all the latest cricket from Perth, Brisbane and Pakistan. There's a new world superbike champion. Miles Stewart wins the biggest triathlon in the Southern Hemisphere. And Ireland's raid on Australia's biggest racing prize. Vintage Crop still not a certain starter in Tuesday's Melbourne Cup.
It's only bruising. I'm happy that's all it is.
To the weather now, and it's been a pleasantly summery day in most of our major centres. From Cairns almost down to Sydney it was fine and hot, then cloudy down to Melbourne. Fine weather continued right across the south with temperatures rising inland. The satellite photograph shows a little cloud still around the east and southeast, but generally clear skies. A cold front is moving up from the Southern Ocean ahead of a high nearing Perth and pushing the one in the east over the Tasman. So tomorrow looks like being fine right down the east coast with, again, temperatures rising. Much the same pattern should hold across the southern regions, although a change is approaching Adelaide with that low. Frogs are about to tell us humans just what we're doing wrong to our environment. For this is the start of National Frog Week, when scientists will be looking to the little amphibians for crucial information.
In anyone's language, tadpoles and frogs are one of the best natural barometers of water pollution levels, particularly because their eggs released into the water are so susceptible to chemicals.
More croaks the better, that's what it's all about, because no croaks means that we've got real problems in our waterways.
Mr Watton says today's launch of the frog census marks the first community and government-involved study of frogs in Australia. This week it's expected 600 schools, individuals and community groups, including the Frog Watch organisation, will record sounds from areas they think frogs should be.
Whether there are frogs there or not, we need to know.
It's expected the results will be collated by the new year and steps taken to increase frog numbers.
And it's important for the community to be involved in this because this is our waterway, and it's the areas that need to be protected by us and the general community around us.
Stephanie Taylor, 10 News.
And that's all from the 10 Newsroom for this Sunday, the 30th of October. Stay with us. Sports Tonight is next with Bill Woods. I'm Sandra Sully. Thanks for joining us, and I'll see you next week. Good night.